Hello, I'm back today with another birth story. Last time I did my very first birth story with my eldest baby. That was a hospital vaginal birth with gas and air, and it's in the description box if you want to go and watch that. And today I'm going to be talking about the birth of my second baby, which was a home birth. So I decided to have a home birth after my experience with my first birth. Once I knew what a contraction felt like and how I handled that sort of pain, it made sense to me that I could do this at home. I'd feel more comfortable. I don't really like hospitals at the best of times, and I felt more at ease with the fact that I could control my environment if we were at home. I could have everything I wanted food wise. I could have a birth pool if I wanted. There was none of that worry of what if we get to the hospital and the room with the pool isn't available or anything like that. The other massive bonus of home birth was that all my antenatal appointments would be with the same person, and that person would hopefully be the person that would be there when I was in labour. And that for me is just such a significant thing. Like, having someone who you're familiar with you during labour is such a help. And also what was good was that all my antenatal appointments would be at home, which meant I didn't have to traipse into hospital and wait around for hours with a toddler. I'll be honest, it was mainly my decision to have a home birth. Sam, my partner, wasn't really on board with it, and still to this day isn't really on board with home birth. For Sam, it wasn't really a safety aspect or anything like that. It was more that when you have a baby in the hospital, you get to walk away and leave that room, and also there's cost involved with having a home birth. You have to hire or pay for a birth pool and all the sort of things that you want to have there with you, whereas at hospital it's mainly all provided. In our opinion as well, with a home birth there is more kind of work involved for your birthing partner. One thing that we didn't really realise until we'd had our home birth was that Sam was doing a lot more than he would do if it was a standard hospital birth situation. When you have a baby in the hospital, you can kind of rest at that point, and so can your partner, whereas at home when you've had a baby, there's some cleaning up to do, there's some organising to do. The exhaustion for Sam was worse with a home birth because he had more to do, so that's something to consider. And I would suggest, if that's a potential issue for you, look into getting a doula or a second birth partner so that there's more hands on deck. That briefly sums up our little pros and cons debate when we were trying to decide whether we should have a home birth or not. So now I'm going to go on to the actual birth. So with Rory, my second son, who I'm going to talk about now, I actually went overdue, which was my first experience of this because his older brother arrived 3 days before his due date, so I never got that going over feeling, or is this going to happen today? It was just, I wasn't expecting to go that quickly with him. Whereas with Rory, he wasn't really overdue. It was 3 days past his due date, so it was hardly any time at all. But there was a slight kind of feeling of waiting around for him. Added to this was the fact that my labour with him started off really slowly. It was very stop-start, whereas with my eldest, I'd just gone straight into it. It was no contractions, no symptoms at all, into regular contractions. With my second baby, there was about a day or two of kind of early labour. I was niggling for a while with kind of crampy pains, but nothing very regular. And I remember going to bed those 2 nights thinking, is this going to be it? Is this the day that he arrives? Or, oh, is it just going to stop overnight again like it has done? So the day that I went into labour had been one of those evenings. The whole evening before, I had had niggling little pains, and I thought maybe this is going to turn into something. And then I went to bed and it all stopped, and I woke up in the morning feeling completely normal. My eldest Arlo, who was 2.5 at the time and was still breastfeeding, he came into bed and had a feed. It was a work day, so I didn't even think about telling Sam to stay at home. At that point I wasn't feeling anything, so he got up and got ready for work and left the house. Meanwhile, I got up, started pottering around in the kitchen, making Arlo's breakfast, and literally almost immediately after standing up and walking around for a few minutes, I started to get quite strong contractions. After about half an hour, I realised that they were actually pretty regular, and then it dawned on me that perhaps this was it and we weren't going to be going back from this now, and this was actually my labour day. So the reason that I mentioned Arlo breastfeeding that morning is because I kind of feel like that helped set things off with my labour. I know that like nipple stimulation and breastfeeding as well, I think, can both be a thing that can help things along with early labour. and I really feel like I went from 0 to strong regular contractions straight away. So maybe that morning feed did help to take that early labour niggling feelings into proper labour. My mum and my sister were coming round that day anyway, so I spoke to them that morning and said, I know you're coming round in like 45 minutes anyway, but just so you're aware, you're probably going to be taking Arlo away with you because I think I'm in labour. The next kind of hour or so is a bit of a blur. So I was on my own in the house with a 2.5-year-old, and I am now in established labour. And I remember walking around packing the few bits that Arlo needed that I hadn't yet packed for his overnight stay with grandma. And I remember trying to sort of keep it together for him and just being like, yeah, it's fine. You know, I mean, he didn't notice anything anyway, but in my head, there was that pressure of like, I'm in labour, my head wants to concentrate on one thing, but yeah, I've got my toddler in the house with me and I need to kind of just stay sensible and focused for him. So I felt really torn in my head and I couldn't really kind of get into the right headspace at that point. Poor Sam had literally just got to work. I think he'd just like taken his coat off and sat down at his desk when I called and said, I think you should probably come home because I'm in proper labour now. Meanwhile at home things ramped up a bit and I'm not sure exactly how much time had passed between talking to my mum and Sam and this happening, but in my head I have this really vivid memory of like kneeling by our sofa with Arlo like climbing over my back as I sort of powered through this quite strong contraction and feeling suddenly a little bit panicky that no one was here with me and it was just me. And my mum and my sister arrived shortly after this, and by this point I just wasn't really in the mood to even talk or communicate. I just wanted to get into my labour headspace, so I kind of quickly packed Arlo off with them, gave him that emotional goodbye cuddle because next time I see you there's going to be 2 of you and you're not going to be my only child. And then I kind of just wanted them to get out of the house. Sam arrived at this point, so my mum felt comfortable that she could leave me because I wasn't going to be on my own. And at this point Sam also decided that we should probably call the midwife. I think it was around 10 in the morning at this point, and I had started established labour at about 8 o'clock, so 2 hours earlier. We hadn't set anything up. At the time we were living in a very small house and there was no space to set up the birth pool in advance or anything, so Sam had to then run around doing that all whilst I was labouring by myself. He had to actually pack down our dining table in order to make space for the birth pool, so it was quite a process and I was on my own for quite a long time. And in that point I was fine dealing with it by myself, but there was a few moments where I thought, you know, I could really benefit from having someone with me, again with my point about either having a doula or a second birth partner, or just being able to prepare a little bit more in advance than we were able to in this situation. I definitely recommend, if you can, having your birth pool up and ready if you're using one, and just minimising what you have to do when you're actually in established labour. So at some point during this my midwife arrived and I was really eager for her to examine me. I thought I was going to be quite far along just because of the frequency and the strength of my contractions, and also because it was my second baby. And everyone tells you with your second baby that there's a chance that they can come very fast, sometimes a lot faster than you were expecting, and that even if you've had a long first labour it can be very different with your second. So in my head I was all geared up to have a really quick amazing labour at home and just be done within a couple of hours. Obviously that didn't happen. She examined me and I think I was just 4.5 centimetres, so not really far from established labour at all, and I remember feeling kind of disappointed, impatient, the same kind of feelings that I've had in all of my labours. Honestly, with this labour I don't really remember specific times of day or specific stages. I think a lot of that is to do with being in my home environment, so there was nothing to take me out of the experience. Like in the hospital, you know, you have the shift changes of the midwives, you have people coming in and bringing you lunch, so you kind of have this vague idea of what time it is, but at home it was just me in my usual environment, and I think that's why the home birth that I experienced was sort of a bit of a blur, but not in a bad way. One thing that was really grounding about being at home whilst I was in labour was that when the contractions really took hold and you just enter that headspace of all you can think about is this situation that you're in, and you kind of just forget like what the purpose of it is, and you're just so focused on the pain, that I at least sometimes forget that I'm even having a baby. I'm like, what is this happening for? Why are we doing this? And every time I'd have a really strong contraction, I'd just see out of the corner of my eye something just really everyday, like, oh, there's my fridge, there's my dining chair. And it just kind of really grounded me and just made me kind of think, you know, everything is fine, everything's relaxed. I know what I'm doing, I know why I'm doing it, I'm having a home birth, I'm having my baby. And that was all really helpful, just mindset wise. So I kind of just got to wander around my house as I normally would. I spent quite a bit of time upstairs trying to relax on my bed because my midwives thought that it might take quite a while and I needed to rest, even though I find it really hard to lie down when I'm in labour because it's painful. I spent a lot of time on the toilet. Again, that's something that I tend to do a lot in labour. And then other than that, I walked up and down the stairs loads. I found squatting into contractions really helpful for the pain management. I didn't want to get into the pool too soon. I wanted to save that for the end. I was really keen for him to be born in the water, and I know that if I get in the pool too early, sometimes that can be too much for me, and I don't like the heat for too long. So I was saving that as a last resort. I used the TENS machine a bit. I didn't use any gas and air at this point. I was just trying to walk around and deal with the pain through movement. So this all going on took us to about 5 o'clock in the evening, I think 4 or 5 o'clock, by which point I was 8 centimeters dilated. And from then things just felt a whole lot easier. It just changes my mindset when I hear that I'm at 8 centimeters, because I know it's almost there. Almost the hard part is done, because I find getting from 4 centimeters to 8, the toughest kind of slog of the contractions, that's sort of the marathon part for me. And then 8 to 10 usually goes very quickly. I've got more motivation because I know how close I am to meeting my baby. So once I heard I was 8 centimeters, that did so much for me positivity wise. I remember just feeling so much better and actually starting to kind of joke around with the midwives and just having like chatty conversations, whereas an hour before I'd just not been able to talk and I'd been totally in the zone. And I remember the transition period just being really calm, especially compared to my other labours. Unfortunately for me, it didn't quite go as quickly from 8 centimeters as I thought it would. It took another 2 hours to get to fully dilated, and that was largely because Rory was in a bit of a funny position inside me. He needed to turn a little bit more in order to kind of descend fully down. I think there was a lip or something that he couldn't get past. I don't know what the technical term is, but I do remember the midwives trying to tell me that he needed to shift a little bit more before he could come out. So yeah, it took 2 hours, which is quite slow progress for that, and by which point I did get in the pool, and the pool was just such an immediate relief. I love that moment when you get in the pool. It's just so much easier to deal with contractions in the water. The pain feels different. You get a relief because your body is kind of cushioned by the water and you feel more rested. It's just great. I really love birth pools. So I spent about 2 hours in the pool, just kind of in a really good mood, chatting to the midwives, joking with them, and just trying to get Rory into a better position to be born. I didn't feel at all at the pushing stage. I know what that feels like, and it's literally an uncontrollable urge to push. Instead, I felt a lot of pressure down there, and I felt like it would feel quite comfortable to push, even though I didn't have the uncontrollable urge to push at this stage. So I asked the midwives if it would be all right if I just pushed a little bit, just to see, you know, how that felt when a contraction came. In my first labour, I'd been told not to do this, and I think I had been told that if you push too early, it can kind of cause damage to your cervix or kind of make things worse. I don't exactly know what the reasoning is, but my home birth midwife seemed fine for me to try it. They didn't suggest that I shouldn't do so. With my next contraction, I gave it a push, and then I gave it another push for the next contraction, and my waters went. As with my first labour, as soon as my waters went, that's when everything started to happen, and I was straight into the pushing stage. Another thing that happened when my waters broke was that there was meconium in the waters. I can't remember what grade, but it wasn't like the best one. but it wasn't the worst one, I don't think, either. His head came down really quickly. This was one part of the labour that was much faster than it had been first time around. First time around I was pushing for almost 2 hours. Second time it felt like 1 or 2 contractions and his head was crowning. With my first labour, the ring of fire wasn't too intense, but with my second labour, I really felt that ring of fire. I think maybe his head was bigger and a little bit more rounder than my first baby's had been, and also I don't know whether maybe being in the pool makes a difference to kind of how much you can feel it, but I did get a little bit panicky at this stage, just because it's a funny feeling, isn't it, when you've got a head coming out of you and you can just feel it so kind of vividly. But it's over really quickly, so it was like a panicky moment for like 1 contraction and then his head was out, and that relief is just the best thing ever, because you know that it's not going to be long and there's only going to be 1 or 2 contractions more and your baby is going to be here. So it's so exciting once you've given birth to that head. Unfortunately, in my case, it wasn't quite so straightforward after this point, and we did have a little bit of trouble getting his shoulders out. I thought his body would just slip out on the next contraction, just like my first had. So it came as a bit of a surprise when the next contraction came and I pushed, and I just couldn't feel anything, or I couldn't feel anything moving. It just felt like a complete block. At this point I was in a squatting position in the pool, and I'd heard that going on all fours can sometimes be a good position to help shift a baby and get their shoulders out. So I went onto all fours for the next couple of contractions and still nothing, like literally there was no movement at all. He was feeling very, very stuck indeed. At this point things did get a little bit scary. There's a certain amount of time after a head's born that you can leave a baby before they need to be out fully. And the midwives did kick into action at this point and told me to get out of the pool because they were going to need to help get him out. So I had to, with a head between my legs, climb out of a birth pool. So they laid me flat on the floor, raised my legs so that my knees were on my chest and they were putting pressure down on my stomach. And then on the next contraction they told me to give it a really, really big push. I'd been giving it a really big push the whole time, but I kind of felt like this was really important this time. I really felt the importance of this contraction. I was like, right, I need to have a word with myself and give this everything I've got, because this baby has to come out now, or we're probably gonna have to call an ambulance, and who knows what's gonna happen after that. So I pushed as hard as I had the strength to, and I felt him shift. It was the weirdest thing, because to me it felt like I knew I had one of the midwives holding my knees to my chest. It felt like the other midwife had her hand up inside me and was pulling him out. He was just such a huge lump of baby that it felt like nothing else. It felt like neither one of my other labours at all. But I did feel him shifting and coming out, and then as soon as we saw him we realised why, because he was rather large. He wasn't massive, he was 9'4", which isn't huge. It's a large baby, but it's not Guinness World Record breaking. But all of his kind of weight was in his chest. He had this like massive kind of puffed out pigeon breast chest. And I just saw him and I thought, well, no wonder I struggled to get your body out, because it's huge. Added to that he was obviously in a bit of a weird position before he came out, just all meant that his shoulder got slightly stuck, which is called shoulder dystocia. The midwives used a particular move on me, which I think is called the McRoberts maneuver. I'm just gonna have to Google that actually, because I can't remember. Yeah, that's right, so it's called the McRoberts position for shoulder dystocia. So you can look that up if you want to see exactly what that was like. I did ask the midwife literally within seconds of him being born. I said, did one of you have your hands inside me, because that's what it felt like, and they said no. I'm still not convinced about this, because it really felt so strange, but maybe it was just how that feels, giving birth to a rather big baby completely flat on your back on the cold kitchen floor tiles. At this point we didn't know if he was a girl or a boy. We saved it as a surprise, so this was the moment when they held him up, and obviously the first thing I saw was just how fat and massive this baby was. The second thing I saw was his willy. I knew immediately what I wanted to call him. Part of my thing with wanting a home birth was the fact that I could just relax afterwards. We could order a curry, I could go and sleep in my own bed. I wasn't on a hospital ward. Unfortunately for me, because of the meconium in the water, I did have to go in and stay on the postnatal ward with Rory for a night because they needed to monitor him for signs of infection. So we did go into hospital. He was absolutely fine, but it was just the safest place for us to be at that point. And I wasn't too gutted because although it would have been nice to stay in my own environment, I kind of like that experience of being on the postnatal ward. It's kind of just, you get that, it's just you and them feeling, and even though it's quite a noisy place with babies crying, in my head it sort of feels quite peaceful. It's like this is the start of something new. It's that one-on-one time with your new baby. I don't know, I just quite like that postnatal ward experience, and I felt with all of my children that it's been quite a special time for us. I did have quite a lot of questions for the midwives in the weeks following my home birth with Rory, because of just what happened at the end, and I had a lot of, well, what ifs? What if we hadn't managed to get him out? What if he hadn't moved and he had stayed stuck? What would have happened? So I kind of mulled that over in my head for quite a while. It was quite a stressful experience at the time, even though it all happened a lot quicker than it felt in my head. In my head, time literally stopped from that contraction where he didn't move until he came out. Time had literally just slowed down, and that whole period of time felt longer than anything that had happened in the labour up until that point. Luckily for me, because I had the home birth team where you get that continuity of care, for my postnatal appointments I had my same midwife who'd been there with me through my antenatal appointments and had been there for the birth. So this is quite unusual actually in the UK. Normally if you're not having a home birth, you're not under the care of that sort of team. You would have someone that you haven't seen before come and do your postnatal checks. So for me it was really fortunate because I'd had a birth that I kind of needed to debrief a bit and I had questions that I wanted to ask. It was just so great that I had my midwife come round and I could ask her those questions, because that's not an opportunity that everyone gets, which is a shame if you've had a stressful labour or things didn't go to plan. It's really quite difficult to not have that opportunity to debrief it with the people who were there at the time. I got my opportunity to ask my midwife all the questions about what happens after that stage, how many times has that happened before, how long does it normally take to get the baby moving, have you ever had to call an ambulance before, all of these kind of anxieties that had cropped up in the aftermath of having Rory. And my midwife really put me at ease. I mean, they knew what they were doing. I wouldn't say that they were totally in control, because you never quite know how anything's gonna go, but I never felt that they didn't know what they were doing in that situation. They followed all the steps properly. Their advice and their decisions helped get him out in the end. That's what did the trick. And I'm just super grateful for their experience and expertise, and that they managed to get him out. Even though we did have the bit at the end where he got stuck, out of all of my labours, my labour with Rory is the one that I would choose to repeat again if I had to, in a weird kind of hypothetical scenario. That's the one that I would do again. That was my favourite labour. It was by far my most relaxed and my easiest. And as you'll find out if you watch my next video about my third labour, just because you've done it a couple of times, it doesn't mean that your next labour is going to be exactly the same, and there's still room for the unexpected. If you're considering a home birth and you've got questions, do leave me a comment. I will answer anything, and I'd love to try and be helpful to people who are considering a home birth. I wrote a couple of blog posts on it, so I'll put those in the description box as well. And I will also link to my written birth story for my home birth with Rory. Story Rory, that rhymes. I'd also love to hear in the comments, have you also had a home birth? How did you find it? What were the pros and cons? Do you have a birth where you had shoulder dystocia? I've never actually spoken to anyone who had a similar experience, so I'd love to hear from you if that was something you experienced. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and also please don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me. Thanks for watching, see you next time.